Hello and welcome. In this lecture video, we'll continue our discussion of different types of costs and terms associated with management accounting. We'll talk about incremental analysis and key ideas in management accounting as well. Okay, so where we left off in the prior lecture video was talking about direct costs and indirect costs. And we define direct costs as those costs that are easily traceable to a department, product, or service. And we said indirect costs are not easily traceable. And we said we could have insurance on the bottling plant that's easily traceable to that plant because it's for that plant. Insurance on the bottling plant, though, is not easily traceable to the products that we make. Okay? Another example, to give it a little bit more context, would be is if you live off campus with roommates and you have to pay utilities. Right? Everybody has to pay utilities. So those utilities costs would be over here. Are those utilities costs can be easily traced to your apartment. It's for your apartment. But if it's 3 people in the apartment, you have roommate 1, roommate 2, and roommate 3. Can you easily trace those utilities to each roommate? No. Utilities costs are direct to the apartment. They are indirect with respect to each roommate because they can't be easily traceable. Okay? So that's another example for you to understand direct costs versus indirect costs. Those, again, just to summarize, those utilities costs are direct because they can be easily traceable to the apartment. Indirect because they can't be easily traced to each roommate. The other thing is, when we talk about direct or indirect, we have to put it in context. We have to say direct or indirect with respect to what? So you can see that utilities is direct in one context to the apartment. It's indirect in another context with respect to each roommate. Now, when we are discussing direct costs versus indirect costs in this chapter, and also in chapter 19 and chapter 20, we are discussing, in chapter 19 is job order costing, chapter 20 is process costing. So I'll say that a little bit more broadly when we're talking about direct versus indirect with respect to process costing and job order costing. What we're really saying are those costs easily traceable to the product that we make. Okay, that's why insurance on the bottling plant is indirect here, because it's not easily traceable to the products that we make. So we would classify this as manufacturing overhead, which is something we'll talk about soon. And it's an indirect cost because it's not easily traceable to the product that we make. In some other contexts, though, we could say it's direct to the plant. So if we're thinking about getting rid of this plant, maybe selling this plant, that cost would be relevant to keeping or selling this plant, because if we get rid of the plant, we don't have to pay the insurance anymore. But it's indirect with respect to the products. Okay? So I guess to summarize, when I'm talking about direct versus indirect in this chapter and also in job order costing and process costing, I'm talking about is it direct or indirect with respect to the products that we make, not with respect to the department or division, but with respect to the products. Okay? Talk about controllable costs versus non-controllable costs, and non-controllable costs is the top of your next page. Controllable costs are basically what we want to say is that managers should be held accountable for costs they can control. If it's outside of their control, you can't really hold them responsible. I'm recording this during the time of COVID-19 pandemic, and there will be a lot of costs that managers can't control, right? They cannot possibly control some of the costs associated with the economic downturn that's a result of the public health crisis, COVID-19. So you can't hold them responsible for that. You can't say, you didn't meet your profit numbers this year, so we need to replace you. There are some things I'm sure that are within their control, but a lot of the downturn in revenue for a restaurant, for example, it's just outside their control. You can't, it would be unfair to hold them accountable for that. Okay. And that's what we mean with respect to control versus non-controllable costs. If it's outside the manager's control, if it's non-controllable, don't hold the manager accountable. Okay? And that's really what I want you to understand about controllable versus non-controllable costs, is that we want to just hold managers responsible for those costs that they have control over. They have influence over. If they have no influence over it, it's just not fair to hold them accountable for it. Okay? So here's what I want you to do. I want you to pause the lecture video and do these 3 review questions, and then we'll continue our discussion on the next page about key ideas in management accounting and some additional key terms. Thanks. Hello and welcome back. So when you look at the first one, which of the following is most likely to be a variable cost? Cost of materials, depreciation, rent, advertising. We define those as examples of fixed costs. Which of the following is most likely to be a fixed cost? Rent. Labor costs, as we talked about with waiters and waitresses, and also in this context, assembly line labor, which would also be called direct labor. Cost of materials and commissions are variable costs. Rent is fixed. And then our final question, costs incurred in the past that should not be relevant to future decisions are called sunk costs. Okay? So let's look at the next page on some 2 key ideas here in terms of management accounting. The first one is decision making. Decisions rely upon incremental analysis. So we have our incremental analysis right over here, some terms involved. And let me define incremental revenue and incremental cost first. Incremental revenue is the difference in revenue between 2 alternatives. Incremental cost is the difference in cost between 2 alternatives. And then finally, we can say with incremental analysis involves calculating the difference between incremental revenue and incremental costs. So basically the difference between incremental revenue and incremental costs would be our incremental profit. Okay? So, I was thinking, this was a while ago, I used to teach at the College of Charleston, and I had a job offer to come to Mary Washington, which I did accept, and I'm happy to do so. And so I had I had a decision to make. And so I thought about it in terms of this. And I said, well, what would be some of my incremental revenue? I didn't call it incremental revenue. I just said, what are the incremental benefits of taking this job? And I'll just restrict my conversation to purely financial. Okay. I received a raise. Okay. I got an increase in salary from moving from College of Charleston to Mary Washington. So that is my difference in my own revenue between staying at College of Charleston and taking the new job at Mary Washington. Okay. So that's the difference in revenue there. What would be my difference in cost? Well, I had to pay for some of the move. That's if I didn't move, I didn't have to pay to move, right? I also lost some money on my house, And I would say that was also incremental cost. You know, it maybe if I had stayed in the house a little bit longer, the market value would have come back up. And in fact, it did. But that cost, if I stayed in the house, I wouldn't have suffered that loss in market value, or maybe not suffered that loss in market value of the house. But since I moved, if I took the job at Mary Washington, then I would have had to take a loss on the sale of my house. Basically, I bought it for a certain amount, and then when I sold it, it was less than that amount. Okay, so that's the loss in market value. So that cost is relevant. That's an incremental cost. So what I could say is, all right, the loss of market value, let's say it's $1,000, but my raise is $5,000. My incremental revenue is $5,000. My incremental cost, which is the cost between the two alternatives, which would be the loss in market value, right, is only $1,000. In terms of incremental analysis, I take my incremental revenue, which is the $5,000, my raise, minus my incremental cost, which is the loss of market value of $1,000, and then I get an incremental profit of $4,000 for moving. And so just based upon that, I should move. And so what I did here with incremental analysis, calculated the difference between incremental revenue, which is my raise, no raise, incremental cost, sell, don't sell house, loss of market value. I calculated my incremental profit of $4,000. Because I got an incremental profit from moving, I should move and take that other job at Mary Washington. And I walked through something similar to that with my own decision, and there were other additional revenues and costs, not to mention that qualitative factors like maybe I would like the job better and also like living in Fredericksburg better and being close to family. Okay, so those are all other additional qualitative considerations that go into any decision, but they were outside of just that simple analysis that I did right there. Okay, so that's the first key idea, is looking at incremental analysis. If there were some costs that I would have incurred, whether or not I moved or didn't move, then they're not relevant. That's why when we talk about that movie theater example, the price of the ticket, if you paid for the ticket, whether you stay in the movie or you leave the movie, therefore that cost is sunk. Sunk costs are not incremental costs, so they don't matter. If you have revenues or benefits that are the same in either situation, and costs that are the same in either alternative, either situation, they don't matter. They're not incremental, they're not differential, therefore they do not matter. It's only the revenues and costs, or the benefits and costs, that differ between the two alternatives that matter. Okay? And that relates to incremental analysis. The second one is you get what you measure. Okay? So if I measure students on their grades, right, which is what we do, what happens, right? Everybody tries to do everything that they can to get an A in the course. And lots of times that can be a powerful incentive. But sometimes that can backfire. Sometimes that intense pressure to get an A can lead students to cheat. That can happen sometimes. Or maybe it's just simply to memorize the material, not fully try to understand it, or just what do I need to know for the test kind of thing. And so you have to think about however you measure someone, an employee or anyone, you have to think that the way that you measure them, you measure their performance, I should say, the way by which you measure their performance influences their behavior. Basically, that becomes a de facto incentive for them to pursue a certain behavior. And so if you look over here, this is an example of some perverse incentives. So one thing is that IBM used to pay or used to incentivize people to maximize lines of code, so then programmers program by lines of code. And there's also a lot of other perverse incentives. Thanks.